The smartphones right in our pockets, the fuel powering our cars, even the clothes we wear, they all tell a massive 50-year story about how India interacts with the rest of the world. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the sheer anatomy of India's economic evolution, specifically through the fascinating lens of its foreign trade data. From the early post-independence days right up to the turn of the new millennium, honestly, the story of how India built its modern economy is absolutely fascinating. Let's just dive right in.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 5 main areas. First, the need for trade. Then, decades of trade deficits. Third, what India buys and sells. Fourth, India's global trading partners. And finally, implications for India's future.
All right, part 1. The need for trade. Why nations exchange goods.
So, why does any country, especially a newly independent India back in the 1950s, need to look beyond its own borders? Well, it boils down to a pretty simple reality. Foreign trade is just an absolute necessity. I mean, no single economy, no matter how huge, can produce literally everything it needs all on its own. It's kind of like how different regions within a country specialize based on what they have. Nations exchange goods based on their unique natural resources, specific skill sets, and production costs. Really, it's just an extension of internal trade, but on a massive global scale.
But the perks go way beyond just, shipping physical boxes across an ocean. Trade is a vital conduit. It brings in absolutely crucial technical knowledge, fresh ideas, managerial know-how, and of course, foreign capital. You can think of these as the unseen fuel that really powers a country's broader technological growth and boosts employment.
Moving to part 2, decades of trade deficits, tracking the import-export gap. Now this brings us to the central theme of India's modern economic history. When you track the data spanning over 50 years, the sheer scale and volatility are wild. With only a couple of tiny exceptions in the 1970s, India's imports have consistently and heavily outpaced its exports. That makes it what we call a perennially trade deficit country.
To really wrap our heads around the magnitude here, let's pull out 3 pivotal moments. Back in 1950, the deficit was relatively tiny, about 2 crores. But fast forward to 1980, right after those massive global oil price hikes, boom, that deficit balloons to over 5,800 crores. And by the year 2000, we're looking at a staggering gap of over 27,000 crores. The structural reliance on essential imports just relentlessly pushed that gap wider and wider.
A massive turning point in all this data is 1991. That's when the Indian government rolled out the new economic policy, which basically kickstarted a huge import liberalization program. We're talking gradual tariff reductions, bringing those peak rates way down, and virtually wiping out restrictive import licensing for raw materials, intermediate components, and capital goods. Now, this policy shift was totally a double-edged sword. On one hand, it made it so much easier for domestic industries to get the global materials they needed to grow. But on the flip side, it pushed the national import bill substantially higher.
All right, let's hit part 3, what India buys and sells, the changing composition of trade.
So you might be wondering what actual commodities were crossing India's borders to cause these massive deficits. Well, contrasting the 1950s with the 1990s reveals an incredible transformation. In the 50s, India was largely agrarian, really just striving for basic self-sufficiency. Imports were heavily driven by food grains along with some early machinery for heavy industries. And exports, mostly traditional agriculture, stuff like tea and jute. But jump to the 1990s and it's a whole new world. By then, India had pretty much achieved food self-sufficiency. Instead, this rapidly industrializing nation was importing a ton of petroleum, oil, and lubricants, often called POL, and complex capital goods. Meanwhile, the export profile completely flipped and was now dominated by light manufactured goods.
The shift is just dramatic. By the 1980s and 90s, petroleum, oil, and lubricants, again, POL, alongside heavy capital goods, grew to account for roughly half of India's entire import bill. Half! As domestic demand for energy and industrial machinery absolutely soared, these two categories became the undisputed drivers of the country's import growth.
And how did the export side react to all this? Remember those traditional exports of tea and jute we talked about? Well, by the mid-90s, they were old news. Revenue was now driven entirely by non-traditional, light manufactured goods. Gems and jewelry led the pack at 17.1%, followed pretty closely by engineering goods, ready-made garments, chemicals, and leather products. Together, these light manufacturers essentially became the new engine of India's export economy.
Moving right along to part 4,
India's global trading partners, the geographical shift in trade.
It's not just about what is being traded, but who India is actually trading with. The geopolitical map completely evolved over these decades. In the 1960s, trade was heavily tied to colonial legacies and Western powers, so the UK and USA really dominated. Then, in the 1970s, we see the rise of the USSR and Eastern Europe as major suppliers of iron, steel, and capital equipment. By the 80s, India's growing thirst for oil created a massive reliance on OPEC nations. And heading into the 1990s, we witnessed a huge surge in trade with developing Asian countries fueled by regional prosperity and cooperation.
Now, industrialized OECD nations definitely remained a major destination, taking up about half the pie. But the rapid dispersion is what's really interesting here. The share of exports going to other developing nations, specifically in Asia, jumped significantly by the mid-90s. This regional diversification is a truly crucial marker of India's modern trading footprint.
Finally, Part 5. Implications for India's future. Assessing the global footprint.
So what does this whole 50-year anatomical breakdown actually mean for India's standing on the world stage? Well, brace yourself for this surprisingly low number, 0.6%. That's it. Despite decades of internal growth, despite the boom in light manufacturing exports, 0.6% represents India's incredibly negligible share of total world exports in 1999. It barely moved an inch from where it was back in 1970. It highlights a pretty stark reality. India's relative footprint in the global export market remained almost entirely stagnant.
So what exactly is holding it back? Well, there are a few ongoing roadblocks preventing India from fully paying for its imports through its exports. First off, there's an inadequate indigenous technology base, and that really limits the country from breaking into heavy manufacturing. Then there's a serious struggle with price and quality competitiveness on a global scale. Plus, there's that over-reliance on the light manufacturers we saw earlier, the garments and gems. And finally, when you compare it to peers like South Korea or China, India still has a relatively low share of foreign trade in its overall gross national product.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. Can India diversify into heavy manufacturing and consumer durables, much like its East Asian peers did, to finally close that decades-long trade deficit? The anatomy of India's trade has evolved incredibly over 50 years, from agriculture to light industry. But making that next evolutionary leap, that is the absolute key to true global competitiveness. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the data and keep learning.